Hey Meeple people, and on today's vlog, we're going to be looking at Alder the High Sage by Rather Dashing Games. Let's get to it! Alright everybody, so we're about to get into Alder the High Sage by Rather Dashing Games, and Sarah is going to go ahead and explain the game to us. Let's get to it! Explain!
Hi.
Oh, wise one.
So, Alder the High Sage is a game for 2 to 4 players that is set in their element universe. So some of this may seem a little familiar to players if you are familiar with their element game. It takes 30 to 45 minutes according to the box, and it's a pretty simple game mechanically, but it does have some depth of strategy to it too. So the way that we're going to set this up is we're going to set this card in the middle of the table, and this is going to be sort of like the board that we build off of. We're going to be adding elements to this and trying to create particular layouts of each element.
Like what's on your card.
Exactly like what's on my card. There's also Alder, the High Sage. There are our individual sages, each of which starts on our sort of home card. We each have a home card, and the home card has the 4 elements on it, and they show different configurations, right? So for the fire, we kind of want to make this like a sort of T shape. For the wind, we want to make 4 in a row. For the mountains, we want to make 4 in a square. And for the water, we want to make this sort of, I don't know what this shape is called, but we want to make this shape right here. So we have these sages that sit on each of these pieces here. And as we are able to sort of make this board match these shapes, we're able to place our alders out on this board. And the whole point of the game is to get rid of all of your alders before another player is able to get rid of theirs. And I'm calling them alders, but actually they are sages. My apologies. So in addition to this right here, players also start with a hand of 5 of these cards right here. I'm not going to show you mine, but this is what they look like. They have all of the elements on them, and they also have wild symbols and voids. And so the game is pretty simple. On a player's turn, what you're going to do is you're going to take 2 cards from your hand and you're going to add them to the sort of tableau that we're building. There are a couple different ways that you can do this. One is that you can cover over a matching symbol with a matching symbol. So for example, I could put this fire over the top of this fire, right? And I would sort of extend the tableau a little bit here. The other thing that I could do is, again, on our player boards, you'll see that there's this sort of organizational chart looking thing right here. And this tells us which elements can cover over other elements. So for example, water can cover over fire. So if I had this card in my hand and I wanted to add this here or here, I could do that as well. So the cards that you play either have to cover over a matching element or they have to follow this sort of hierarchy chart of which element can cover over which element. So what's going to happen is on my turn, I'm going to take 2 cards from my hand. I'm going to add them to the tableau following those placement rules. Then if I've made a design, for example, let's say that I had been able to make the fire design here. I would add one of my sages to any space on that design that was not occupied by another player's sage or by the high sage. After I've placed my pieces, if possible, and I can do that for multiple. So if I manage to be like just shockingly amazing at this game and I make 2 different elemental groupings here, I could place out multiple of my sages. Once I've placed my sages, then I have to move the high sage. Now the high sage is going to occupy a space on the board that isn't occupied by another player's sage and also is not the void. No spaces can occupy the void right here. So I'm going to place the high sage on the board somewhere, and then I'm going to end my turn by drawing 2 cards. So I'm going to take any face-up card, another card will immediately refill that spot, and then I'll take a second card, and that will be the end of my turn. Then it's my opponent's turn. They will do the same thing. They'll play 2 cards. If they can, they'll place one of their sages. They'll move the high sage, and then they'll refill their hand. And play will just go back and forth between players until one player has managed to place all of their sages on the board. That's pretty much it for a quick and dirty overview. Should we get to it?
Yeah, let's get to it. All right, well, we'll get back to you guys midway through the game, and let's get into Alder the High Sage by Rather Dashing Games. See you all in a bit. Hey, Meeple people, welcome back. So this is the mid-game of Alder the High Sage from Rather Dashing Games, and so yeah, this is the midpoint, and we're tied up. I have 2 sages out there. Sarah has 2 sages out there, and it's getting close. It's like you give a little, you get a little, you get a little, you give a little, and it's just I'm muddling over my own words. But let's go ahead and see what Sarah has to say about this game so far and what she thinks about our midway point of it. Hello.
Hi there.
How are you?
So we've been able to each put out 2 of our sages. If you look at the board, you can actually see where Nick was able to make the wind configuration here. However, all of the other patterns we've used to place our sages have been sort of covered over, so you can no longer see the patterns we used to make those. But I was able to place out my water sage here in a figure that was like in this area, and then I was also able to place my fire out in one. There were fire under all of these tiles at one point in the game, and then Nick, same thing. He's been able to place his wind here, as I pointed out previously, and his water here, but that again has been covered over. So we've each placed out 2 of our 4 sages. First person to place out all 4 wins the game. I think it's going well-ish. It's a little hard to tell, especially because we are sort of neck and neck at this point. But there's some sort of like hidden strategies in this game, and one of them is the high sage. So on every player's turn, you have to move the high sage, and he can move anywhere on the board except for places that already have another sage, because only one sage can ever occupy a space. He also can't inhibit wild areas or voids. If there were a void on the board, he couldn't step into those spaces. So he does have some limitations as well, but he's a really, really useful tool for trying to block off things, because since when you create one of the elemental patterns, no other sage can be in that pattern except your own, it means that when you move the sage on your turn, you can potentially block spaces that your opponent might be able to use to create an element pattern that they need. And it means that because he's basically sitting there, they're not allowed, even if they make that pattern, they're not allowed to place their own sage in it because the high sage is there. So he's definitely got some sort of hidden depth to the strategy of his placement.
That seems like a lot of the game where it's like there's a lot of hidden strategy and there's a lot of depth to the game. It's like one of those games where it's easy to learn, but it takes a while to master, and each game is a totally different game.
Yeah, for sure.
Where you can interact in different ways.
Yeah, especially because there's a lot of these cards, and they get shuffled up every time, so who knows exactly which combination of cards you're going to get. And the rule set is pretty simple. You play 2 cards, you move the sage, you draw 2 cards. That's basically your turn. And it's very, very simple to know, like, okay, there's some simple rules that govern how you can place things on the board, how the sages interact with the board and that kind of stuff. It's very, very simple rule set. But the strategy of this is really interesting, especially because you have this sort of, like I said, that like the hierarchy chart, you know? So trying to manipulate the board state, you're like, okay, if I could just get, X element right here, then I would be able to place my token for that element. But in order to do that, I'm going to have to cover over this piece with this element so that then eventually I can cover over that with this other element. But and if it was a solo experience, sure, you could just line those up, bing, bang, boom, no problem, right? But when you're playing with an opponent who also has their own agenda, then you're having to sort of work around what they're doing to manipulate the board state as well.
And this is only a 2-player game. I think this goes up to 4?
This goes up to 4 players. So if we were playing with more players, they would also be, influencing the board state on their turns. So I think that may provide a little bit more opportunity by the time it gets around to your turn, but also more complication as well. Because not only do you want to set up the board so that you can place your sages on the board, but you also don't want to make it too easy for them to be able to place theirs. So you don't want to set up anything really amazing unless you're also able to claim it or use the high sage to sort of block it, because then they could just take it. So if they're able to just manipulate it just a little bit, you don't want to do all the heavy lifting and then hand it off to somebody else who's going to be like, cool, thanks. So it's definitely very interesting. I think it's a pretty strategic game, but it's also a pretty simple game. And for me, with high strategy games, if I'm going to play a high strategy game, then I want it to be low complexity. I don't mind high strategy as long as it's low complexity. If I've got high strategy and high complexity, sometimes I get kind of burned out on that. But high strategy, low complexity is great, and I feel like this game does that in, I was going to say spades, but maybe elements is better.
And we also want to thank Rather Dashing Games for giving us this game to do a video on. We were at Gen Con 2021 and we got to talking with them, and we liked ALDR, the High Sage, when they showed it to us, and I wanted to go ahead and show it off. So they gave us a review copy, and we thank Rather Dashing Games for doing that. And yeah, so I think it's time that we get back into it and see who will be the winner and loser. And yeah, so let's do it. All right, we'll see you guys in a sec. Bye. Hey, Meeple people. So we just finished ALDR, the High Sage, and I was the victor. Yay! So we're going to get into some final thoughts about it. Let's start off with Sarah, then I'll come back to me. So Sarah, what were your thoughts on ALDR?
Well, it's a very interesting puzzle game. It's pretty easy as far as like what you're supposed to do on your turn. It's easy to remember everything you need to do, but strategically it can be very, very challenging. Like I said previously, not only do you have to worry about making the configurations that you need, but you also need to be aware of what you're potentially setting up your opponent to be able to do on their turn. I lost sight of that, and that's why I lost the game. We were both down to just one element left that we needed to create. Nick needed to do his mountains, and I needed to do my wind, and I was setting up something so that I would be able to place the cards that I needed in order to do mine, and I lost sight of what I was basically setting up him to be able to do, and I basically made it so that he could just place like one card, not very difficultly, and achieve his last element configuration. So you really have to be aware of both people in the game, and in some games, it's nice to have sort of like that multiplayer solitaire feel, where you're just kind of building your own thing and somebody can't really like influence that or interrupt it or, mess it up for you. It can be really frustrating for me when I'm like building my own thing and like other people have the ability to come in and change it or influence it or affect it. Yeah, just like, don't touch my stuff. I don't want you to touch my stuff, right? So if you struggle with that, this game will be frustrating, but I think that there's a double-edged sword there, because it means that when you're able to complete your goal in spite of that, in spite of the other player constantly trying to like throw you off, then it feels more satisfying, in my opinion. So a little bit of frustration, yeah, for sure. But when you are able to actually complete your goal, despite having to, contend with another player touching your stuff as you go, then it can feel pretty rewarding. I like the art style in the game. It's pretty simple. It's pleasant to look at. For me personally, it is a little hard to get this to stick in my head. So like I said previously, each element can cover over another element, right? And they have this, it's an easy to use chart, but I don't know why this is just a little bit of a struggle for me. So like in this case here, you can cover over fire with wind. You can cover over mountains with, that's wrong. See, that's my point. For some reason, this is difficult for me to get stuck in my head. So I can cover over fire with water. I can cover over water with mountains. And I can cover over mountains with wind and wind with fire.
I think you have that reversed.
Yeah, see? So I don't know why.
It's earth covers water, water covers fire, and fire covers wind.
Okay. So that's the way it's supposed to go. And it's like laid out here visually in a very easy to understand way. But in my head, I don't know why this is just a little challenging to get that to stick. So throughout the game, in addition to the mental exercise of trying to just do the puzzle, I also had to keep in mind like how this sort of structure worked. And for me, that was a bit of a challenge. But I do have some mental issues that make that kind of stuff a little bit harder for me. I have problems with my short-term memory and things like that. So I don't know that was necessarily like the fault of the game. That was probably just like my own personal interaction with the game. What did you think, Nick?
I liked it. I liked how puzzly it got. I know going into a game that people can touch my stuff or touch what I'm trying to do. That seems like I'm more prepared for that. And another interesting thing is the last thing I needed was earth, and the last thing Sarah needed was wind. So she could have always used what she needed to win the game to cover up what I needed to win the game. It was an interesting kind of like last thing, but
that is a point of strategy that I would maybe point out, is that I personally think that it's best for players to try to do their elements in an order, which means that it doesn't come down to you and your opponent both needing to do the same one.
Yeah.
Because that makes it really challenging. You're trying to like block them from being able to do it, but you're also trying to do it yourself. And then they're the same thing. They're trying to block you from being able to do it while they're also trying to build it themselves. So I would just say that, like, just as a minor point of strategy, especially if you're playing a 2-player game, don't let it happen that you both end up needing to build the same elemental structure as the last one, because I feel like that could really increase like the tug of war feeling and the feeling of only marginal forward movement in the game.
But yeah, so I liked it. We got to a point in the game where this happened, where there was a bunch of the same, a lot of the same, symbol. All the water was coming out, and there's not a thing that you can do about that. There's nothing in the rules to where it says like if so many of one type come out, you can sweep
you can flush the market.
You could
or
probably
like
do
that
in a
you can maybe make like a house rule or
house
something,
rule for that.
Upon the third of the same type, you flush the whole thing and get
because that got to a point where we're like no one wanted water, because we got towards the end of the game and this was only a 2-player game, so we still had it was just like we both didn't want the same thing, and so that's why I kind of cluttered up the I
think it's kind of
area.
interesting though, because you can't top deck in this game, so you have to pick what's out here. And I think that this sort of market situation creates a unique choice that players have to make, where you say, okay, well, clearly water is very prevalent out here, right? There's a bunch of double waters. If I take a double water, is there something I can do with that where I can manipulate the board state where, okay, I don't actually need water, but maybe I need, what covers over water? Fire, right? No, wind. Mountains.
Mountains coming from water.
Sorry, mountains. So like if I take a double water and I place it somewhere on the board, then maybe I can place a mountain over one of those waters on a future turn, and then maybe I can place something over that mountain. So it does create the situation where you're kind of forced to work with what you have. And because of the cover over sort of, mechanic in this game where you're like covering over elements with other elements, I think it creates a further depth to the puzzle where you're like, okay, if this is all I have to work with, how can I manipulate this structure so that, like, okay, if all I have to work with right now is water, I can either use that as a blocker for my opponent, right? If they're trying to create something, I can just like use the water to like mess that up for them. Or how can I turn this water into the elements that I need it to be so that I can make the shape that I'm looking for? So I do think it does stymie the game a little bit to have so few choices out here in the market, and maybe a flushing system would be good. Yeah, but I also think that it sort of forces players to think, okay, how can I manipulate the game state to my advantage, even though these cards are not preferable? So I do think that there's a double-edged sword to the non-flushing market.
Yeah.
I did want to talk about the the components as well. So all of this is standard. The cards are they're not quite tarot-sized cards. They're a little skinnier, I think, than tarot-sized cards. But all of the cards are nice. The components have good feel to them. The little Alder High Sage, he's pretty cool. He's got like a golden finish, but it's got like this false patina that they've actually like painted onto him. So he's got some cool detailing. And I feel like all in all, it presents a just sort of a table presence that's very seamless. Like the theme and the strategy, or the theme and the mechanics seem well married. And the way that the game is presented sort of just elevates that, in my opinion. So I think they did a really, really nice job with the components. They're not, I wouldn't say that they're like the highest quality, right? The cards are a little thin and these are not super heavy or anything like that, but everything is nice. And I think that all of it, the art style, the theme, the mechanics, all have a really, really symbiotic relationship that comes together really, really pleasantly on the table.
Agreed. So yeah, I don't think I have anything else on this game. It was nice of Rather Dashing Games to give us a copy so we can do a review and a vlog on it. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that's all we got on Alder, the High Sage from Rather Dashing Games. We'll see you all next time, and don't forget to subscribe if you are not subscribed, and we will have a link in the description of this video to the BGG link page for Alder, the High Sage. Alright, well that's it. We'll talk to you guys later. Bye!